February 9th, 1967, 3:47 p.m. Harlem Hospital, room 412. Bumpy Johnson lay in a hospital bed with tubes running from his arms and a heart monitor beeping steadily beside him. He'd suffered a massive heart attack 3 days earlier while meeting with policy bankers in his office above Small's Paradise. The doctors said he was lucky to be alive. They also said he'd need at least 6 weeks of recovery before he could even think about going back to work. 6 weeks was a lifetime in Harlem's underworld, and Vinny the Suit Romano knew it. Vinny stood at the foot of Bumpy's bed with 2 of his associates flanking him, both large men with the kind of build that came from years of enforcing rather than thinking. On the small table beside Bumpy's bed, Vinny had placed a legal document, 5 pages long, with a signature line at the bottom. "It's simple, Bumpy," Vinny said, his voice carrying the practiced calm of someone who'd made this kind of proposition before. "You're in no condition to run Harlem right now. The Genovese family is willing to assist with operations while you recover. All we need is your authorization. Temporary, of course, just until you're back on your feet." Bumpy's eyes, despite his weakened state, were sharp and focused. Temporary. 6 months, maybe a year, however long it takes for you to get your strength back. And after that, Vinny smiled. After that, we renegotiate based on the new landscape. What Vinny was really saying, what both men understood perfectly, was that once the Genovese family established control of Harlem's operations, Bumpy would never get them back. This wasn't a temporary arrangement. This was a takeover disguised as assistance, and the only thing standing between Vinny and complete success was Bumpy's signature on a piece of paper. Bumpy looked at the document. His right hand, the one without the IV, rested on the bed beside him. He could reach the pen. He could sign. He was alone, weak, recovering from a heart attack that could have killed him. No one would blame him for making this deal. "I need to think about it," Bumpy said quietly. Vinny's smile faded slightly. "Bumpy, I'm trying to be respectful here. I came to you first, offered you a dignified transition. But if you don't sign this, if you make me go around you, it's going to be messy, and in your condition, messy is the last thing you need." One of Vinny's associates shifted his weight, a subtle movement that suggested the conversation was about to change tone. That's when they heard footsteps in the hallway outside, fast footsteps, purposeful. Frank Lucas had been on his way to visit Bumpy when he'd heard voices from inside room 412. He'd stopped 10 feet from the door, listening, trying to identify who was in there, because Bumpy's doctor had been very clear, no visitors except family for at least another week. The voices were unfamiliar, male, multiple people, and one of them had just said something about things getting messy. Frank's hand moved to his waistband, where he carried a .38 revolver, and he pulled it as he pushed through the door. The door swung open, and Frank Lucas stepped into the room with his gun drawn, barrel pointed at the floor, but ready to come up in less than a second. He'd expected maybe 2 people. He saw 3, all of them turning toward him, 2 of them reaching inside their jackets. For half a second, the room balanced on the edge of violence. Frank's gun started to rise. The 2 associates' hands found their weapons. Vinny's right hand moved toward his hip. Then Frank's eyes met Vinny's, and Vinny recognized him. "Frank Lucas," Vinny said, his hand stopping halfway to his weapon. Frank Lucas didn't know the Genovese family made house calls to a hospital. The 2 associates had their guns out now, not pointed at Frank, but not lowered either. 3 armed men in a hospital room, none of them shooting, but all of them calculating whether they should. "This is private business," Vinny said, trying to regain control of the situation. "Between me and Bumpy." "Bumpy's recovering from a heart attack," Frank replied, his voice level. "Doesn't look like he's in any condition for business. We were just having a conversation. With 2 armed men, that's a strange kind of conversation."
Vinny's jaw tightened. His associates were looking at him, waiting for the signal. They could take Frank, probably, 3 against 1. But Frank Lucas wasn't just anyone. He was Bumpy's protege, his most trusted associate, and the kind of man who'd proven multiple times that he didn't go down easy. More importantly, if shots were fired in this room, if Bumpy Johnson was caught in the crossfire, or even just present during a shootout, every family in New York would view it as a violation of the most sacred rule. You don't bring violence to a man's hospital bed. The calculation took Vinny 3 seconds. "Lower your weapons," Vinny said to his associates. They hesitated. "I said lower them." Slowly, reluctantly, the 2 men lowered their guns, but didn't holster them. Frank didn't lower his. He kept it pointed at Vinny, kept his eyes moving between all 3 men, kept his position in the doorway where he could see everyone and no one could get behind him. "We're just leaving," Vinny said. He reached for the document on the table. "Leave it," Frank said. "This is illegal. Leave it." Vinny's hand stopped. He looked at Bumpy, then at Frank, then back at Bumpy. "We'll talk again when you're feeling better." "No," Bumpy said from the bed, his voice weak but clear. "We won't."
Vinny's face hardened. "Bumpy, you're making a mistake. You can't run Harlem from a hospital bed. Someone's gonna fill that vacuum. Better it's us, people who respect you, than someone who doesn't." "Get out," Frank said quietly. The 2 associates looked at Vinny, waiting for instructions. Vinny stared at Frank for 5 long seconds, weighing options, calculating odds, deciding whether this was worth pushing. Frank's finger moved closer to the trigger guard. Not inside it, just closer. That small movement made the decision. "Let's go," Vinny said. The 3 men moved toward the door, and Frank stepped aside just enough to let them pass, but not enough to lower his guard. As Vinny walked by, he stopped for half a second. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "Yes, it is," Frank replied. Vinny and his associates left the room. Frank waited until he heard their footsteps fade down the hallway, waited until he was certain they were in the elevator, and only then did he lower his weapon. He closed the door, locked it, and turned to face Bumpy. For 10 seconds, neither man spoke. Bumpy was looking at Frank with an expression that was difficult to read. Not gratitude exactly, not relief, something else. "You heard them from outside," Bumpy finally said. "I heard voices, didn't sound friendly." They weren't. Frank walked to the chair beside Bumpy's bed and sat down, placing his gun on his lap, but keeping his hand on it. What did they want? "Harlem." Bumpy gestured weakly to the document Vinny had left behind. "Temporary control while I recover, which means permanent control once they establish themselves." Frank scanned the first page, then set it back down. "You weren't going to sign it." "I was thinking about it." That surprised Frank. "Why?" Bumpy was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight Frank had never heard before. "Because I'm weak right now. Because I'm lying in a hospital bed with tubes in my arms and doctors telling me I might not make it to next month. Because every day I'm in here is a day someone else can make moves I can't counter." He paused. "And because I'm tired, Frank. I've been running Harlem for 30 years. Maybe it's time to let someone else handle it." Frank leaned forward. "You don't believe that." "Don't I?" "No, because if you did, you would have signed that paper before I walked in. You were stalling, you were buying time, you were waiting for something." "For what?" "For this," Frank gestured, to the room, to himself, to the situation. For someone to walk through that door and remind you that you're not alone, that even when you're weak, even when you're in a hospital bed, you've still got people who'll stand with you. Bumpy studied Frank for a long moment. Then, slowly, a small smile appeared on his face. "You held a gun on 3 Genovese soldiers in a hospital room." "Yes."
"If that had gone wrong, if they'd fired first, you'd have been dead. Maybe. Or maybe they would have been. 3 against 1? I've faced worse odds." Bumpy's smile widened slightly. "You're either very brave or very stupid." Can't it be both? For the first time since his heart attack, Bumpy laughed. Not a full laugh, his condition wouldn't allow it, but enough to show that something inside him, something Vinny's visit had almost extinguished, was still there. "When I get out of here," Bumpy said, "we need to have a conversation about Vinny Romano." "What kind of conversation?" "The kind that makes sure he never walks into a hospital room with a contract again." Nod nodded. "I can help with that. I know you can. That's why I've been training you for 5 years." 6 weeks later, Bumpy Johnson walked out of Harlem Hospital under his own power. He was thinner, weaker, moving slower than before, but he was walking. Frank Lucas was waiting at the entrance with a car. They didn't go home. They went directly to Small's Paradise, where Julius Gordon had arranged a meeting with every major player in Harlem's underworld. 30 men who controlled the neighborhood's economy, who'd been waiting to see whether Bumpy would recover or whether they'd need to start making arrangements with new management. Bumpy walked into that room, still weak, still recovering, but present, and the message was clear. Harlem's king hadn't abdicated, he'd just been temporarily unavailable. Over the next 3 months, Bumpy and Frank worked together to systematically dismantle every operation the Genovese family had tried to establish in Harlem during Bumpy's hospitalization. They didn't use violence. They didn't need to. They just made it clear, through careful pressure and strategic moves, that Harlem wasn't available for takeover. Vinny Romano tried twice more to establish a foothold. Both times he found his operations shut down before they could gain traction. By June 1967, the Genovese family had pulled back from Harlem completely, and Vinny had been reassigned to operations in New Jersey. The story of what happened in room 412 became legend, though the details were always fuzzy, because the only people who'd been there were Bumpy, Frank, and 3 men who had no interest in advertising how close they'd come to starting a war in a hospital. But everyone understood the core message. Bumpy Johnson, even at his weakest, even lying in a hospital bed recovering from a heart attack, was still protected. Not by armies or soldiers, by loyalty, by Frank Lucas walking through a door with a gun drawn and making 3 armed men decide that whatever they thought they could take wasn't worth what they'd lose trying. Bumpy Johnson lived for 1 more year after that day in the hospital. He died in 1968, not from another heart attack, but one that came while he was having breakfast at Wells' restaurant, surrounded by friends, active and engaged until the very end.
Frank Lucas continued operating in Harlem for years after Bumpy's death, building his own empire, making his own mistakes, following his own path. But he never forgot February 9th, 1967, the day he'd walked into a hospital room with a gun drawn, and 3 men had decided that taking Harlem wasn't worth dying in a place where people went to heal. The day he'd proven to Bumpy that the 5 years of training, the lessons, the mentorship, all of it had created exactly what Bumpy had intended. Someone who understood that power wasn't just about being willing to pull the trigger. It was about making other people believe you would if you had to. Frank Lucas never fired a shot that day, but everyone in that room left believing he would have. And that belief, that certainty, was more powerful than any bullet. That's what Bumpy had been teaching him all along. Not how to fight, how to make fighting unnecessary. Because the most dangerous person in a room isn't the one who shoots first. It's the one who makes everyone else decide that shooting isn't worth the cost. Frank Lucas walked into room 412 that day as Bumpy's protege. He walked out as something more. The man who'd stood between Harlem's king and the people who wanted his crown, and in doing so proved that even kings, when they're weak, survive through the strength of the people who stand beside them. 3 guns drawn, 0 shots fired, and Harlem stayed exactly where it had been for 30 years, in Bumpy Johnson's hands. Because Frank Lucas had learned the most important lesson Bumpy could teach. Sometimes the best move is the one you don't make, the shot you don't fire, the war you don't start, but everyone knows you could. And that knowledge, that certainty, is the only weapon that never runs out of ammunition.